The first confirmed count came in at 0317 hours, Geneva Coordinated Time, on a Tuesday that no one who lived through it would ever forget. 90,412,783,214. Admiral Yara Osei read the number 3 times before she set down her coffee. The mug was still warm. The world outside the unified Terran command bunker was quiet, pre-dawn dark, smelling of pine and distant rain. She pulled up the casualty manifest on her secondary screen and just looked at it, colony by colony, station by station, outpost by outpost, a list of settlements that had been alive 22 hours ago and were now classified under a single bureaucratic category: total loss events. Kepler Station.
Gone.
New Carthage.
Gone.
The Meridian Belt settlements, 47 separate habitats, some as small as research outposts, some as large as cities, all gone. The attacks had not been random. That was the first thing the analysts established, and it was the detail that changed everything. Random attacks were the work of pirates, of opportunists, of creatures acting on hunger or fear. What had been done to humanity's colonial holdings across 7 star systems in a single coordinated strike was something different. It was surgical. It was deliberate. And it was a message. Osei had spent 31 years in military service. She had survived the Proxima conflict, the Ganymede riots, the long grinding border skirmishes with the Vihari Compact that had consumed a decade of her life and most of her left shoulder. She knew the difference between an act of war and an act of extermination. This was extermination. She walked to the Situation Room where her senior staff were already assembled, holographic star maps floating above the central table, red markers blooming across the display like a hemorrhage. Deputy Commander Elias Roth stood near the far wall with his arms crossed, jaw set in the particular way that meant he was controlling something he did not want to show. Chief Intelligence Officer Priya Nandan was speaking in rapid, low tones into her earpiece, while simultaneously annotating data on a tablet. None of them greeted Osei when she entered. There was nothing to say that the room wasn't already saying. She stood at the head of the table and studied the map. The attacks had originated from Karath space. That much was clear within hours of the first emergency signals reaching Earth. The Karath were not unknown to humanity. They were a species that the Terran Diplomatic Corps had engaged with cautiously for 11 years, a civilization older than the Roman Empire and considerably less interested in negotiation. They communicated in gestures of force more than in words. Humanity had known this and had tried anyway because that was what humans did. They tried. They extended hands. They built bridges to species that sometimes responded by burning those bridges down. The Karath had not merely burned bridges. They had glassed worlds. What made the number, 90 billion, so difficult to hold in the mind was not its size, though its size was incomprehensible. It was that each unit in that number had been a person. Had been a mother arguing with a teenager over curfew, a geologist taking core samples from a moon's crust, a baker pulling bread from an oven at 4 in the morning, because that was when the bread needed to come out. Each number had been a heartbeat. Osei had a daughter at New Carthage. She had not told anyone this yet. It was not relevant to the decisions that needed to be made, and the decisions were the only thing that could not wait. "What do we know about their force composition?" she asked. The briefing that followed was precise, detailed, and delivered without sentiment by people who were all privately holding their own versions of loss. Intelligence estimated between 14 and 18 Karath fleet clusters had participated in the coordinated strike. The weapons used were classified as mass denial ordnance, devices designed not to destroy infrastructure but to remove biological presence from a volume of space. It was a weapon of genocide dressed in the polite language of tactical categorization. "They weren't trying to take our colonies," Nandan said. "They weren't after resources or territory. This wasn't expansion." "Then what was it?" Roth asked. "A demonstration," Nandan said. "They want us to know what they're capable of. They want us to calculate the cost of continued presence in those systems and decide it isn't worth it." The room was quiet. Osei thought about her daughter, who had been studying atmospheric science on New Carthage, and who had sent a voice message 3 weeks ago complaining cheerfully about the local food and asking if her mother could send real coffee because the colony-grown stuff tasted like ambition and regret. She thought about 90 billion people who would never send another message to anyone. "Get me the Joint Chiefs," she said. "Get me every fleet commander within communication range. Get me the Civilian Council and the colonial representatives."
She paused.
"And get me the Karath diplomatic frequency. I want to know if they're going to say anything." "They won't," Nandin said quietly. "No," Osei agreed. "They won't. But I want the record to show we asked." She looked at the map one more time. All those red markers. All that silence. Humanity had always been a species that did not know when to stop. Every naturalist who had ever studied human history, every alien diplomat who had ever sat across a table from a human negotiator, had eventually arrived at the same observation. Humans were aware of their own mortality and chose, collectively as a culture, as a civilization, to act as though it were someone else's problem. They built things that would outlast them. They named stars they would never visit. They sent messages into the void that would not arrive for centuries, addressed to recipients who did not yet exist. This quality had frustrated allies and confused enemies in equal measure. It was about to become something else entirely. "Initiate protocol vigil," Osei said. "Full communication blackout to civilian networks for 6 hours. I don't want panic before we have a posture. And I don't want the Karath to hear us thinking." She turned away from the map. Somewhere, 22 light hours away, the ruins of New Carthage were cooling. The atmosphere was still there. The Karath weapons had been specific about what they removed. The buildings were probably still standing. The bread in that baker's oven had probably burned by now. 90 billion. She walked to her office, sat down, and did something that would not appear in any official record. She allowed herself 1 minute. She set a timer. She put her face in her hands, and she made no sound, and she let the number sit on her chest like a stone. The timer went off. She straightened, opened her console, and began drafting the communication that would change the shape of the galaxy. The Unified Terran Command emergency session lasted 9 hours and 40 minutes without a break. By the time it concluded, people had quietly excused themselves to compose themselves in the corridor outside, including General Hideo Tanaka, who had fought on 3 continents and 2 moons and who was not a man given to visible emotion. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody would. The data presented during those 9 hours was not dramatic in the way that news broadcasts would later make it. There were no speeches, no raised fists, no moments of cinematic clarity. There was a table covered in cold coffee cups, a holographic display that someone kept accidentally bumping so that the star maps shifted and had to be reset, and a series of voices speaking in the careful, deliberate cadences of people who understood that what they said in this room would echo outward into history and could not be unsaid. The core question before the council was deceptively simple. How do you respond to the death of 90 billion people? The complication was that there was no precedent. Nothing in human military doctrine, nothing in the long and often brutal history of armed conflict on Earth and its colonies, had ever addressed an event at this scale. Wars had been fought over thousands of deaths, over hundreds of thousands. The great catastrophes of human history, the pandemics, the genocides, the wars that had restructured civilizations, were dwarfed by what the Karath had done in a single coordinated action lasting less than 4 hours. The second complication was strategic. The Karath were not a minor power. They commanded a volume of space nearly 3 times larger than human-settled territory. Their fleet numbers were estimated. Intelligence on Karath military capability was frustratingly incomplete, at somewhere between 4 and 6 times the total Terran combined fleet strength. A conventional military response, the kind that doctrine provided for, would be devastating to humanity. The models showed it clearly. Direct engagement at current force ratios produced outcomes that ranged from catastrophic to existential. This was, everyone in the room understood, exactly what the Karath had calculated. They had not attacked because they were afraid of humanity. They had attacked because they had looked at humanity's expansion, at the rate of colonial growth, at the trajectory of Terran technological development, and had decided that the most efficient solution to a future problem was to demonstrate, now, that humanity could be erased. It was a cold logic, and in its coldness it was almost comprehensible. Almost. Dr. Asha Mehrotra from the Strategic Analysis Division had spent the previous 6 hours building what she called the response architecture. She was 39 years old, had never served in the military, and had the particular manner of someone who had grown up being the smartest person in most rooms and had learned to be careful about showing it. She presented her findings without theatrics, walking the assembled commanders through a framework that had taken her team less than a day to construct because the mathematics, once you accepted the scale of the problem, was not actually complicated. The Karath made a strategic error, she said. A significant one. They optimized for shock. They hit 90 billion people in a single event because they believed the magnitude of the loss would produce paralysis, political, psychological, military. They expected us to calculate the force ratio differential, recognize we cannot win a conventional war, and begin de-escalation negotiations from a position of demonstrated weakness. Silence in the room. That is not what is going to happen, she continued. Not because the force ratio calculation is wrong. It isn't, we genuinely cannot win a conventional engagement at current fleet strength, but because the Karath have misunderstood something fundamental about human psychology at scale. General Tanaka leaned forward. What have they misunderstood? Mehrotra looked at him steadily. They assumed that 90 billion deaths would make us afraid. What it has actually done is remove the internal political constraints that would normally limit the scope of our response. Any action that the Terran Council could contemplate before today would have faced opposition, economic objections, diplomatic considerations, public concern about escalation. Those constraints no longer exist. The Karath didn't intimidate us into restraint. They gave us permission. The room processed this. Permission for what? Admiral Osei asked, though she already knew. For everything, Mehrotra said simply. The response architecture that followed was not built around the question of what humanity could do. It was built around the question of what humanity was willing to become. It drew on every classified program that had been quietly developed and quietly shelved over the previous 3 decades, the ones that were too destabilizing to deploy, too extreme to authorize, too dangerous to acknowledge in peacetime. The contingency plans that military planners had constructed against the possibility of exactly this kind of moment, filed away in classified archives under the general heading of last resort scenarios. Those files were opened. The document that emerged from the 9-hour session was called the Galactic Retaliation Doctrine, and its preamble was brief. In response to the confirmed deliberate extinction of 90 billion, 412 million human lives across 7 star systems, the Unified Terran Command, acting with full authorization of the Terran Civilian Council and the Colonial Representative Assembly, hereby commits the totality of human industrial, scientific, military, and civilizational capacity to a single coordinated response. This response will be proportional not to the force employed against us, but to the result. The measure of what we become from this moment is the measure of what was taken. It was not a declaration of war. War implied 2 parties with comparable standing in a dispute. This was something older. Something that lived in the part of the human genome that remembered when survival was not guaranteed and had decided, collectively, that it was worth fighting for anyway. It was a reckoning. There's a concept in xenobiology, still debated, still contested, but persistent enough in the literature that most serious researchers take it seriously, called the cornered predator paradox. Most species, when faced with a threat significantly larger than themselves, optimize for survival. They retreat. They hide. They find the calculation of continued existence more compelling than the calculation of resistance. This is rational behavior. It is the behavior that natural selection tends to reward. Humans do not reliably do this. The Karath had access to xenobiological data on humanity. They had been observing human civilization for longer than most humans realized, passive observation, the kind that left no obvious trace, cataloging behavior patterns across centuries of Earth history and decades of colonial expansion. Their analysts had noted the cornered predator paradox in human behavior, had flagged it as a potential variable, and had ultimately concluded that it was a factor at the individual level that did not translate meaningfully to civilizational decision-making.
They were wrong about this.
It was the most expensive error in the history of their species. What the Karath analysts had observed correctly was that individual humans behaved irrationally when cornered. What they had failed to model was what happened when an entire civilization was cornered simultaneously. The behavioral irrationality did not cancel out at scale. It amplified. It organized. It found direction. Humans, when pushed past a certain threshold, do not calculate odds. They calculate cost, not the cost of fighting. The cost of not fighting. The cost measured in every future moment that would not exist, every child that would not be born, every song that would not be written, every small and private joy that would evaporate if the species chose compliance over resistance. Humans were perhaps unique in the known galaxy in their ability to make that calculation and arrive at the conclusion that the cost of surrender exceeded the cost of any war, no matter how terrible. The industrial mobilization that followed the emergency session moved at a speed that surprised even the people running it. Within 72 hours of the session's conclusion, every civilian manufacturing facility in Terran space had received its conversion orders. The factories that made agricultural equipment began retooling for armor plate. The shipyards that built passenger liners extended their frames and started laying keels for warships. The research institutions that had been quietly working on technologies deemed too dangerous for peacetime application received authorization codes that unlocked classified development files. The civilian population was told the truth. This was not the instinct of every government in human history, but OSE and the Council had agreed on it. The people had a right to know what had been done to 90 billion of their own, and they had a right to know what was being asked of them in response. The announcement was made simultaneously across all Terran communication networks, read personally by the Secretary General in a broadcast that lasted 11 minutes and was watched, in various forms, by every human being old enough to understand language. The response from the civilian population was something that analysts would study for generations. There were no riots. There was no panic. There was an almost eerie collective stillness, a moment of processing, followed by what could only be described as resolution. Within 48 hours of the announcement, the voluntary enlistment rate for Terran Combined Fleet Services had increased by a factor of 37. Manufacturing output targets that planners had projected would take 6 months to reach were exceeded in 11 weeks. Scientists who had retired, engineers who had left the defense sector, pilots who had left service for civilian careers, all of them began calling in, asking where they were needed. A Karath observer, had one existed in that moment, would have struggled to categorize what they were seeing. It did not look like a species preparing for a war it expected to survive. It looked like a species preparing for a war it had decided was necessary regardless of whether it survived. These are not the same thing. Commander Elias Roth oversaw the initial fleet expansion from the orbital shipyards above Titan, working out of a converted administrative module that smelled permanently of machine oil and the synthetic coffee that was the only beverage reliably available in sufficient quantity. He slept 4 hours out of every 24 and was aware that this was not sustainable and did not particularly care. What he watched from the observation port of that administrative module was not what he had expected mobilization to look like. He had run mobilization drills. He knew the doctrine, the timelines, the bottlenecks. He had expected chaos, friction, the inevitable grinding inefficiency of a system trying to do too much too fast. Instead, he watched something he did not have a precise word for. The closest he could come was purposeful. Every worker on every ship in every yard had access to the same information he had. They knew what had happened. They knew who they were building for. The 90 billion were not an abstraction to the people laying those keels and welding those hull plates. They were brothers and cousins and friends, and the people from their hometown who had gone to the colonies because the colonies were where the future was, or so everyone had believed. The ships being built in those yards were not weapons, exactly. They were arguments. Long, cold, heavily armed arguments that humanity intended to carry to the Karath home systems and deliver in person. Roth stood at the observation port and watched the arguments take shape in the dark, and he thought about all the species in the galaxy that had made the mistake of thinking humanity's greatest weakness was its tendency toward hope. That was not a weakness. That had never been a weakness. It was the engine. The word doctrine comes from the Latin dicere, to teach. Military doctrine is, at its core, a body of accumulated teaching about how to apply force effectively. Every major military in human history had doctrine. Most of it was built on experience, on the lessons learned from previous wars, refined through analysis and codified into principles that could be taught and applied. The Galactic Retaliation Doctrine was different in one fundamental way. It was not built on past experience because there was no past experience to build on. There had never been an event like this. There had never been a civilizational scale attack on humanity, never been a loss of this magnitude requiring a response, never been a situation where the full industrial and military capacity of the species needed to be directed outward in a single coherent direction. The doctrine was not refined from previous wars. It was constructed, essentially from first principles, by people who understood what had happened and what it required. The person most responsible for the doctrine's operational structure was not a military officer. She was a mathematician. Dr. Yuki Sato had spent 20 years working on what her field called large-scale system coordination, the mathematics of how complex systems could move toward a goal when the individual components of those systems had different information, different capabilities, and different constraints. Her work had been applied to things like supply chain optimization and pandemic response modeling. She had never expected it to be applied to war. She was brought in 70 hours after the emergency session, introduced to a room full of admirals and generals with the brief explanation that she understood how to make very large numbers of things move in the same direction without losing coherence. She looked at the problem they presented her and spent 6 hours working through the mathematics and then presented her conclusions. The key insight was counterintuitive, and it took several hours of back and forth to convey it to people trained in conventional military thinking. Traditional military campaigns were designed around a central command structure, information flowing up, decisions flowing down. This worked well at small scales. It became progressively less functional as scale increased because the information pipeline became a bottleneck and the decision latency became operationally crippling. At the scale the Galactic Retaliation Doctrine required, hundreds of fleet elements operating across multiple star systems, often out of real-time communication range, a centralized command structure would fail. What Sato proposed instead was something she called distributed coherence. Each fleet element would be given not orders but objectives, and more importantly, a complete understanding of the strategic purpose behind those objectives. Instead of awaiting instructions, commanders would make local decisions that were consistent with the overall doctrine because they understood the doctrine at a level deep enough to derive the correct decision themselves. This required an extraordinary level of trust. It required fleet commanders who were not just skilled tacticians but strategic thinkers who could hold the entire picture in their heads and act in alignment with it without real-time coordination. The military leadership looked at this proposal with the particular expression of people being asked to violate everything they had been trained to believe. Admiral Osei understood it immediately. "You're describing something closer to a culture than a chain of command," she said. The first Terran fleet element crossed into Karath space 214 days after the emergency session. It was not a strike force. It was a reconnaissance formation. 9 ships, all of them modified for silent running, all of them crewed by volunteers who understood they were flying into sensor coverage that was more comprehensive than anything humanity had previously navigated. Their mission was not to engage. It was to see. Commander Adissa Yeboah commanded the formation from the bridge of the TCS Inquisitive, a modified survey vessel that had been refitted with military-grade sensor arrays and just enough armament to discourage pursuit if they were spotted. He was 44 years old, a career intelligence officer who had spent the previous 15 years studying Karath communication patterns, and he was precisely the kind of person the doctrine had been designed to produce, someone who understood not just what he was looking for, but why finding it mattered. What the formation found, over the course of 61 days of careful, slow transit through the outer margins of Karath space, was different from what the pre-war intelligence models had suggested. The models had assumed the Karath were aware of their strategic situation and were preparing for a human response. The models had assumed defensive consolidation, fleet concentration, hardening of military infrastructure. The models had assumed the Karath understood what they had started. The observation suggested otherwise. There was activity in Karath space, fleet movement, industrial output, the kind of low-level military preparation that a civilization undertook when it expected a response. But there was something else. Something that took Yeboah several days of observation to correctly categorize. The Karath were continuing their normal operations. Trade routes were functioning. Civilian shipping was moving between systems. There were signals that corresponded, based on prior intelligence analysis, to political communication between Karath administrative centers, the ordinary bureaucratic traffic of a civilization managing itself. The military preparation was real, but it sat alongside civilian normalcy in a way that was only consistent with one interpretation. The Karath did not think humanity was coming. They had calculated the force ratio. They had modeled the response. They had concluded that their rational choice for humanity, faced with the demonstrated cost of resistance, was to accept the new boundary conditions, to pull back, to negotiate from weakness, perhaps eventually to accept a permanent reduction in territorial ambition. They had built their defensive posture around that expectation, adequate to deter a punitive raid, inadequate to stop what was actually coming. Yaboa's report, when it arrived at Terran Command after the long transit delay, was read by Osei with the focused attention she gave to things that changed the shape of a problem. "They don't know," Roth said, standing at her shoulder. "They know we might respond," Osei said carefully. "They just don't know we've decided to." There is a quality of human decision-making that is difficult to model from the outside, especially for species that optimize more purely for rational self-interest. It is the quality of making a decision that is not in your immediate interest, not even in your likely long-term interest, for reasons that are less about calculation and more about something that does not translate cleanly across species. Call it principle.
Call it identity.
Call it the particular stubborn refusal, built into human civilization at a level below conscious policy, to accept a universe that worked the way the Karath had decided it should work. The Karath had killed 90 billion people and expected a civilization to make peace with that because the alternative was too expensive. They had not understood what they were dealing with. The second formation, a strike element, 6 vessels, specifically configured, entered Karath space 39 days after Yaboa's reconnaissance. It was followed over the next 4 months by 11 more. Each element moved on a slightly different approach vector. Each element had been assigned specific objectives within the doctrine's framework. None of them needed to wait for orders from Terran Command. They had been given the doctrine. They understood it. They could execute it alone. The first engagement happened at a Karath fuel processing installation in the outer reaches of their third occupied system. A Karath patrol element of 4 ships encountered a Terran strike formation of 5. By every conventional metric, the forces were roughly comparable. The engagement lasted 43 minutes. 3 of the 4 Karath ships were destroyed. The 4th transmitted a damage report back to Karath Command before it too was disabled. The content of that damage report, when it was eventually decoded by Terran intelligence, contained something remarkable. The Karath commander had apparently spent the final minutes of the engagement attempting to understand why the Terran ships were fighting the way they were. The tactics did not follow any pattern in Karath records of human military behavior. There was no apparent withdrawal consideration. The Terran ships accepted damage in ways that the Karath commander found tactically irrational, pressing forward through hits that should have triggered standard survival protocols, pushing engagement ranges closer than defensive doctrine recommended. The commander's report ended with a sentence that the Terran intelligence analysts marked and returned to repeatedly in the months that followed. "They fight as if they have already accepted the cost." That was, in 4 Karath words, the most accurate description of humanity's strategic posture anyone had produced on either side of the war. The long approach, as it came to be called, was not a single advance. It was a slow tide, patient, methodical, and impossible to halt at the edge, because it was not coming from an edge. It was coming from everywhere. "Yes," Sato said. "The doctrine has to be internalized, not just obeyed. The fleet has to become a distributed intelligence that shares a single purpose. Every captain, every pilot, every technician has to understand not just what they're doing but why, well enough that if they were suddenly the most senior officer in their area of operations, they could continue the mission correctly without anyone telling them what to do." "That takes time to build," Roth said.
"We have some of the time," Sato said.
"Not much. But it's the only approach that scales to what you're trying to do." The training program that followed was unlike anything in the history of Terran military education. Every officer in the combined fleet, from admirals to ensigns, went through an intensive immersion in the doctrine, not memorizing its provisions but understanding its logic, its values, its vision of what humanity was trying to accomplish and why. The program was designed by educators as much as by soldiers. It drew on techniques from leadership development, from organizational psychology, from the science of how people internalize values rather than merely following rules. Alongside the military preparation, the scientific and industrial elements of the doctrine were taking shape. The weapons programs that had been shelved were back on the table. Some of them were breathtaking in their scope, technologies that had been theorized and partially developed but never finalized because peacetime had not provided a reason to pay the cost. The cost was now irrelevant. The only question was whether something could be built in time. 3 programs in particular would define what humanity became in the war that followed. The first was the Cascade Drive, a propulsion system that, in its theoretical form, allowed fleet elements to transit between systems faster than any existing technology. It had been in development for 11 years and was 18 months from operational testing when the Karath struck. The timeline was compressed. The engineering teams worked in extended shifts, made decisions that they would not have made under normal conditions, accepted risks that peacetime caution would have rejected. The first operational Cascade Drive was installed in a fleet carrier 14 weeks after the emergency session. It reduced transit time to the Karath home systems by 60%. The second was the Persistent Denial Array, a weapon system that operated not through direct destruction, but through the sustained denial of resources. Rather than attacking Karath military assets directly, it targeted the infrastructure that supported those assets. Supply lines, manufacturing nodes, fuel sources. The Karath had used extermination weapons against humanity's colonies. The Persistent Denial Array was, in a dark and clinical sense, humanity's answer in kind. Not extermination, but the patient dismantling of everything that made continued resistance possible. The third program was not a weapon. It was a network. The colonists who had survived, those on settlements not targeted in the initial strike, those who had been in transit when the attacks occurred, those on installations at the edge of Karath sensor range who had gone dark and stayed dark, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They were dispersed, frightened, and cut off. The network, which the planners called the thread, was designed to find them, connect them, supply them, and ultimately use their positions, deep in contested space, in places the Karath assumed were empty of human presence, as forward intelligence assets. The Karath had attacked to demonstrate that humanity could be removed. They had not removed everyone, and the ones they had not removed were angry in a very specific and operational way. Nobody talks about what victory costs until after it arrives. Before, there is only the mechanics of achieving it, the logistics and the tactics and the doctrine, and the relentless machinery of a civilization at war. After, when the machinery finally quiets, there is a silence that is harder to endure than the noise. The war lasted for years, 2 months, and 17 days. At its conclusion, in the formal sense, with the Karath hegemony's senior command authority transmitting a cessation of hostilities request through the emergency diplomatic protocols that had been, with bitter irony, established during the 11 years of cautious pre-war contact, the human cost of the response was just over 2 million military dead, with roughly 8 times that number wounded or otherwise affected. 2 million. Against 90 billion. 2 million might seem small. The ratio was the kind of number that historians and strategists would discuss at length, analyzing the doctrine's effectiveness, the force multiplication achieved by the Cascade Drive, and the distributed coherence model, the role of the thread network in providing intelligence that shaped engagement outcomes. The ratio was, from a purely military analytical perspective, extraordinary. It did not feel small. There is no loss threshold below which grief becomes acceptable. There is no number of dead that a family holds and finds reasonable. Every one of the 2 million had a family, had friends, had a particular laugh, and a specific way they made their coffee, and things they had meant to do that they never got to do. The doctrine had been efficient. It had achieved what it set out to achieve. It had not been free. Admiral Osei attended every memorial she could reach in the 8 months following the cessation. She was not required to do this. Her staff gently suggested, repeatedly, that her time might be better spent on the reconstruction coordination, on the diplomatic framework being built around the Karath capitulation, on the 100 pressing concerns of a civilization that had just fought the largest war in its history and now had to figure out what came next. She went to the memorials, anyway. Her daughter had been on New Carthage. There was no body to bury. There was no grave to visit. There was a memorial plaque on a wall in Geneva with a name on it among 90 billion other names, because someone had understood that the names needed to be written down somewhere, even if the wall required to hold them all was 17 kilometers long and still somehow felt inadequate. She found the name on the third day she visited the wall. She stood there for a while, in the way that people stand in places where there is nothing to do and nowhere better to be, and she was aware of other people doing the same thing all around her, people who had walked 17 kilometers of names and found the ones they were looking for and stopped. The wall was never empty. There was always someone there. At all hours, in all weather, people came and found their names and stood. Roth found her there on the fourth day and stood beside her without saying anything for a long time. They had known each other for 20 years. They had the kind of professional relationship that contained, at its foundation, genuine respect and the particular intimacy of people who had spent a crisis together and would spend the rest of their lives carrying the weight of the decisions made in it. The Karath Council has formally requested a diplomatic process, he said eventually. They want to establish a framework for, they called it normalized coexistence. Osei kept her eyes on the name on the wall. What do the analysts think? That the request is genuine. That what we did scared them enough to make it genuine. He paused. The doctrine worked, Yara. It did what it was supposed to do. I know. That's something. Yes, she said. It is. She thought about the 9-hour session, the cold coffee cups, the holographic map with its spreading red markers. She thought about Merotra and her concept of permission, about Sato and her distributed coherence, about Yaboa somewhere in deep space counting Karath sensor installations and understanding that the patterns were wrong. She thought about the engineers on Titan who had worked 4-hour sleep cycles for 14 weeks to install the first Cascade drive. She thought about the volunteers in the Thread network who had spent months in silence on the margins of hostile space, sending data they could not know was being received, acting on faith in a doctrine they had internalized completely. She thought about a voice message from New Carthage, complaining cheerfully about synthetic coffee. We need to do something with the reconstruction proposal for the colonial systems, she said. There are families who had people on those worlds who want to go back. They want to rebuild. Roth looked at her. You think they should? I think humans have never needed a reason to go back to a place, Osei said. They only need someone to remove the obstacles. The reconstruction of the 7 destroyed colonial systems would take a generation. Some of the worlds would be inhabited again within 5 years. Others would take longer. New Carthage, where the atmospheric damage from the extermination weapons had left a residue that required remediation before human habitation was safe, would be the last. 9 years after the war's end, the first new settlers would land on soil that had been uninhabitable and would begin again with the ordinary human confidence that what had been broken could be rebuilt. They would name their first settlement Remembrance. It was not an unusual choice. All across the 7 systems, people making new beginnings insisted on names that looked backward as well as forward. They did not want to forget. They were afraid, and rightly so, that forgetting was the thing that would make it possible for something like this to happen again. The 90 billion were the answer to every future argument about whether a threat was serious enough to warrant response. The 90 billion were the reason the Galactic Retaliation Doctrine remained in force after the war, updated and refined but never retired, because humanity had learned something irreversible about itself and about the galaxy it inhabited. Being known was not the same as being safe. Being feared was not the same as being at peace. But being willing to pay any cost in defense of your own, that was something different. That was a message that, once delivered, tended to stay delivered. 20 years after the emergency session, Dr. Asha Merotra gave a lecture at the University of New Geneva that was attended by 300 people in person and approximately 40 million remotely. She had been asked to speak about the Galactic Retaliation Doctrine, its origins, its logic, and what it meant for humanity's ongoing relationship with the broader galaxy. She was, by then, 61 years old, the most decorated civilian in Terran history, and still possessed of the manner of someone who had spent a lifetime being the smartest person in most rooms and had learned to be careful about showing it. She spoke for 90 minutes without notes. The part that was most replayed in the years afterward was not about the doctrine itself. It was a passage near the end, in response to a student's question about whether what humanity had done was justified. She had paused before answering, not in the way of someone collecting their thoughts, but in the way of someone deciding how honest to be. Justified is a word that belongs to the moment before a decision, she said. Once you've made the decision, you don't get to appeal to justification anymore. Justification is the argument you make before you act. What you carry afterward is the decision itself, and everything it cost, and everything it bought. We carried 90 billion dead into a war we weren't sure we could win, and we won it, and we remade the strategic landscape of this part of the galaxy in a way that has reduced the probability of civilizational-scale conflict for at least several generations. We did that by becoming something that was necessary to become, and that we might have preferred not to be. Was it justified? I think the better question is, what kind of species would we have been if we hadn't? She let that sit in the room for a moment. Humanity has always been good at transformation, she continued. We change faster than most species find comfortable. We change in response to pressure, in response to loss, in response to the discovery that what we were before is no longer sufficient for what we're facing. The war changed us. We are not the same species that sent diplomatic missions to the Karath with genuine hope of a lasting peace. We know things about the galaxy now that we would have preferred to learn differently. We know that presence is not safety. We know that expansion into the dark requires more than optimism. We know that 90 billion people can die in 4 hours, and that the universe does not pause to grieve. In the front row of the auditorium, an elderly woman named Yara Ose sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened. She had retired from active command 6 years earlier, though retired was not quite the right word for someone who remained a permanent advisor to the Terran Strategic Council and who spent the portions of her time not devoted to that advisory function, working on a project she rarely discussed. The project was a comprehensive record, not a history, exactly, but a record of the 90 billion. Not an accounting, not a statistical summary. A record, in the sense of a document that tried to hold something of each person who had been lost. It was an absurd undertaking. She knew it was absurd. It would take the rest of her life, and the rest of many other people's lives, and it would still be incomplete. She continued it anyway because the alternative was to let the number swallow the people, and she had spent 20 years refusing to let that happen. Merotra was reaching the end of her lecture. The Galactic Retaliation Doctrine is still in force, she said. It is, if anything, more comprehensive now than it was. Other species are aware of it. The Karath are aware of it. There are civilizations at the edges of our contact range that have reviewed the record of the war and adjusted their own strategic calculations accordingly. This is, I think, the doctrine's most important function, not as a plan to be executed, but as a message that has already been delivered. She paused. The message is simple. It is not a threat, exactly, though it functions like one. It is more like an explanation. We are a species that builds. We make things and name things and send messages into the dark hoping someone will answer. We extend our hands to strangers because we understand that strangers become neighbors and neighbors become allies, and the galaxy is too large and too uncertain to navigate alone. We want peace. We have always wanted peace. She let the next sentence arrive slowly. But we have learned, now at a cost that should never have been necessary, that peace is not a condition you receive. It is a condition you establish. And we have established it in the only language that certain kinds of power understand. The room was quiet. Outside the university windows, the city of New Geneva went about its ordinary afternoon. People moving through streets, children arguing outside a school, a market stall doing slow business in the thin autumn sunshine, the unremarkable persistent business of people being alive and intending to remain so. The 17-kilometer wall with 90 billion names on it stood 4 blocks away. It was a permanent fixture of the city now, not a monument in the sense of a thing you visited on commemorative occasions, but a presence in the everyday landscape. People walked past it on their way to work. Children touched the names out of curiosity. The names were there the way the mountains were there, enormous and unchanging, a feature of the world that the people who lived alongside it had gradually incorporated into their understanding of what their world was. Some mornings, Ose walked its length before breakfast. She did not read every name. There were too many, and she had long since accepted that the number was not a thing that could be held all at once. But she walked it. She moved through its presence. She let the weight of it settle on her in the ordinary, manageable way that weights settle when you carry them long enough that they become part of how you move. This was what humanity carried forward. Not just the doctrine. Not just the strategic realignment of galactic power. Not just the cascade drive and the thread network and the distributed coherence model that military schools across the Terran sphere now taught as foundational. They carried the names. All of them. Imperfectly, incompletely, in ways that would always fail to capture the full reality of what had been lost. They carried them the way humans had always carried their dead, too heavy to set down, not heavy enough to stop them from moving. There was a Karath philosopher, the first Karath thinker whose work had been translated into human languages and published in the cautious cultural exchange that followed the war's end, who had written, in the context of analyzing the conflict, something that human readers found simultaneously accurate and unsettling. The humans did not defeat us because they were stronger, the philosopher wrote. They defeated us because they did not stop. We calculated that the cost of their response would exceed their willingness to pay it. We were wrong because we did not understand what they were paying for. They were not paying for victory. They were paying for the right to remember their dead with something more than grief. They were paying for the ability to look at 90 billion names and say, "We answered. Whatever we became, we answered." Merotra finished her lecture. The applause began. In the front row, Ose sat with her hands folded and her eyes steady, and her expression the particular kind of calm that is not peace, exactly, but is what you build in the place where peace used to be when peace has been taken from you, and you have decided to build something that lasts. Outside, the autumn light lay across the wall of names. Inside, 40 million people were listening. The names did not change, but they were, in every meaningful sense, remembered.